Madrid, 1834. The corridors of the palace are quiet, but not silent. There is the sound of hushed footsteps, whispers in corners, the clink of a lantern chain. Word has spread, the king is dead. Ferdinand VII of Spain has breathed his last. Yet your duties as the royal physician have not ended with his passing. Instead, they have taken a turn so grotesque, so unprecedented, that even a man hardened by years in the service of monarchs feels his stomach tighten in dread. A summons arrives in the night. It is not the Council of State, nor the Archbishop, but the Queen Regent herself, Maria Cristina of Naples and Sicily, who calls for you. She stands at the threshold of the late king's private chambers, veiled in grief, her eyes hollow from sleepless hours. Her voice trembles as she explains what must be done. Not the embalming of a monarch's body, which would be expected, not the preparation of his visage for eternity, a ritual performed countless times before. No, she has a request far more intimate and infinitely more disturbing. You step into the chamber. The air is thick with incense, an attempt to mask the sweet metallic odor of decay. Ferdinand lies beneath sheets of white silk, his features frozen in a final grimace that still seems to mock those who behold him. Death has not softened his expression. The man who terrorized Spain for 2 decades, who betrayed allies, humiliated his wives, and crushed revolutions, looks as though he is smirking at you from beyond the grave. But it is not his face that seizes your attention. It is what lies beneath the sheets, what the Queen Regent has commanded you to preserve. His grotesquely oversized, misshapen endowment, a cruel trick of nature that defined not only his intimate life, but, in ways both subtle and horrific, the course of Spain itself. Your hands tremble as you ready your instruments. You are no longer simply preserving flesh. You are preserving a symbol, the embodiment of a reign as deformed and destructive as the body it inhabited. In centuries to come, whispers will persist of this anatomical monstrosity. Historians will glance at the subject, then quickly look away. Clerics will hide records deep in Vatican vaults, and yet here you stand, staring at the obscene relic that outlived the man's dignity. Your mind wanders as you begin your work. You remember the palace gossip, the stories of specially designed cushions, of terrified brides screaming in their wedding chambers, of miscarriages, of whispered accusations of poison. You recall the rumors that his sexual deformity had shaped his paranoia, his cruelty, his obsession with control. And as the scalpel meets flesh, you cannot help but think, this is not merely the preservation of a body part. This is the preservation of a kingdom's darkest metaphor. For Ferdinand's reign was like his anatomy, excessive, unnatural, grotesque. A reign that smothered Spain under the weight of its own deformity. He had been born into decay, raised in dysfunction, and carried within his body the monstrous legacy of centuries of royal inbreeding. His story is not only that of a king, but of a nation crushed beneath the fragile ego of a man who could never escape his shame. Before we trace the bloody path of this monarch's life, from the cursed cradle of his birth to the shattered Spain he left behind, we must pause. Because to understand Ferdinand VII, you must first understand the disease in his bloodline. His deformity was not random, nor was his cruelty accidental. Both were the inevitable offspring of centuries of dynasties that chose blood purity over sanity, tradition over survival. Thus begins the tale of the most perverted king in Europe's history. A story not of triumph, but of torment, where a single man's body mirrored the collapse of an empire. To understand Ferdinand VII, you must begin not with his reign or even with his childhood, but with the centuries of poisoned legacy that created him. For Ferdinand was not born whole nor free. He was the inevitable outcome of dynasties that had treated their family tree not as branches, but as a closed loop, folding back upon itself until nature itself recoiled. The Spanish throne had long been cursed by the practice of royal inbreeding. The Habsburgs, obsessed with keeping power within their bloodline, had married cousins to cousins, uncles to nieces, often generation after generation. When their dynasty finally collapsed, the Bourbons who succeeded them carried the same flaw, a belief that blood should be preserved at all costs, no matter how twisted the results. By the time Ferdinand came into the world on October 14, 1784, at the royal palace of El Escorial, the genetic dice had been loaded against him. His parents, King Charles IV of Spain and Queen Maria Luisa of Parma, were themselves first cousins. Their union was less a marriage than a dynastic contract, an arrangement intended to strengthen ties between branches of the same diseased tree. And Ferdinand, their son, would be the proof that centuries of such unions had consequences too monstrous to ignore. From the moment of his birth, attendants whispered that the prince seemed unfortunate. Some spoke of his strangely delicate features, others of his nervous temperament. He was a sickly child, prone to fevers and fits of melancholy. At first, these seemed like the ordinary ailments of infancy. But as Ferdinand grew into adolescence, it became clear that something deeper was amiss. By his teenage years, the court physicians were already murmuring about his abnormal development. His anatomy, they noted in secret records, was of extraordinary dimensions and unnatural form, a grotesque deformity that both fascinated and horrified those entrusted with his care. One physician, writing in the margins of a hidden report, remarked, "Nature, in her fury, has made a cruel experiment upon His Royal Highness." But Ferdinand's curse was not only physical. His home life was a theatre of dysfunction that left scars more lasting than any bodily deformity. His father, Charles IV, was a gentle, weak-willed man, more interested in hunting than in ruling. His mother, Queen Maria Luisa, was the opposite, strong-willed, scandalous, and openly involved with Manuel de Godoy, the ambitious court favourite, who quickly became the real power in Spain. Imagine the boy Ferdinand watching as his mother flaunted her lover while his father sulked in silence. Every corridor of the palace echoed with gossip. Servants whispered, courtiers smirked. Foreign diplomats wrote gleeful letters back to their masters about the Spanish queen's indiscretions. And Ferdinand, already humiliated by the whispers of his abnormal body, absorbed the lesson. That power was betrayal, that trust was weakness, that intimacy meant ridicule. Children of royalty are often raised as symbols. Ferdinand was raised as a joke. The servants' laughter followed him like a shadow. Tutors noted that he became suspicious, withdrawn, and prone to sudden fits of cruelty. Even in youth, he seemed to carry an air of resentment, as though the world had wronged him before he had even begun to live in it. Here, at the threshold of manhood, Spain's future king was already twisted by blood, by family, by shame. He had inherited not only the crown of a once great empire, but the accumulated rot of generations. His very body carried that rot in its most intimate form. And it was this deformity, visible only to those closest to him, that would become the secret engine of his paranoia, his cruelty, and his reign of fear. Spain did not yet know it, but in the silent corridors of El Escorial, a monarch was being forged, not from greatness, but from humiliation. A man destined to wear the crown, yet forever enslaved by his own cursed blood. Adolescence is cruel to any child, but to Ferdinand it was unbearable. By the time he reached his teenage years, the whispers that had haunted his infancy grew louder, sharper, and more cruel. Servants smirked behind their hands. Courtiers exchanged glances when the prince entered a room. Foreign diplomats, who should have treated him with reverence, recorded sly observations in their reports home. The boy is misshapen, uneasy, and much too aware of himself. What they could not say openly, they hinted at with cruel laughter, that the heir of Spain was deformed in ways a king should never be. Ferdinand absorbed it all. Every smile looked like mockery, every bow seemed like derision. His paranoia was not entirely misplaced. People were laughing at him. The palace was a hall of mirrors in which Ferdinand saw only his own humiliation reflected back. He began to imagine insults even where none existed, his mind turning every gesture, every word, into evidence of conspiracy against him. And then came the incident that revealed the darkness already festering inside him. One afternoon, a young page accidentally entered the prince's chambers without warning. He stumbled in just as Ferdinand was changing his clothes. For a brief moment, the boy's eyes widened in shock. Then he fled. Most men might have scolded him, perhaps dismissed him from service. But Ferdinand was not most men. To him, the page had glimpsed the secret that defined his life, the grotesque truth of his body, and no one who had seen it could be allowed to remain free. The punishment was swift and merciless. The page was flogged until his back was raw, then cast out of the palace with his family, exiled from Madrid as though they carried some unspeakable contagion. The lesson was clear. Ferdinand's shame was a weapon, and anyone who touched it would pay in blood. After that, those who served him walked carefully. Fear crept into every interaction with the prince. His tutors noted his vindictive nature, how he remembered every slight, no matter how small, and repaid it with cold precision. A forgotten bow, a misplaced word, even a glance held too long could mean dismissal, punishment, or worse. It was here, in these early years, that Ferdinand learned the cruelest truth of all. Power could shield him from ridicule. He could not change his body, but he could wield authority like a whip. Each punishment, each act of petty cruelty, was a way of reclaiming control over a life in which he had none. The boy who had once wept at the servants' laughter hardened into a tyrant in miniature. He began testing his strength the way a child tests a blade, carelessly, recklessly, but always with growing fascination. Those beneath him became pawns in a cruel game, each move a way of proving that he was not powerless, that he was not to be mocked. In truth, the mockery only intensified. The courtiers spoke more quietly now, but the whispers still reached him. Rumors travelled beyond palace walls, carried into salons and embassies, until even foreign courts chuckled at Spain's embarrassment. Ferdinand knew this, and it ate at him like acid. He began to see betrayal everywhere, in the bow of a servant, the smile of a tutor, the hesitation of a guard. The humiliation of his body had become the humiliation of his soul. Ferdinand could not escape it, so he did what so many tyrants have done throughout history. He turned his shame outward. He made others suffer so he could forget, if only for a moment, his own misery. Spain, though it did not yet realize it, was already ruled by this shadow. The resentment of a boy festering in palace corridors would one day explode into the cruelty of a king, and the page who had been flogged and exiled was only the first victim of a life defined by vengeance. By the dawn of the 19th century, Ferdinand's condition had moved from palace whispers to the guarded files of the royal physicians. Few men dared write openly of it, yet in locked drawers and sealed envelopes, a strange archive began to grow. Medical notes, so scandalous they would be hidden for generations. The descriptions were clinical, but their restraint only sharpened the horror. One physician observed, "His Royal Highness is afflicted with a member of such extraordinary dimensions and peculiar form that marital union may prove impossible." Another, less cautious, was blunter. The prince's organ resembles nothing so much as a billiard cue, thin at the base, swollen grotesquely at the extremity, and long enough to serve as a cane. These words were never meant to leave the palace. They were written in coded Latin, locked away in the archives of the court and in Vatican files that would not see daylight for centuries. But within the walls of Madrid, everyone knew the truth. The royal heir was a medical anomaly, a freak of nature whose shame had become Spain's secret burden. The physicians were not content merely to observe. They experimented, desperate to find solutions, or at least palliatives, that might make Ferdinand a functional husband and father. They brewed tonics of powdered pearl, crushed coral, and rare herbs imported at great expense from Asia. They summoned alchemists from Italy, charlatans from Germany, even healers who claimed to know Oriental secrets. All promised miracle cures. All failed. Ferdinand drank elixirs that scorched his stomach and smeared himself with oils that left angry welts on his skin. He swallowed mixtures of rhino horn and ambergris, convinced they might shrink or reshape his monstrous form. Nothing worked. Instead, he grew more desperate, and his desperation made him an easy prey for frauds who lined their pockets while the prince ruined his health. If the quack remedies could not change him, perhaps craft could. And so the palace workshops were turned to a darker task. Artisans who once made saddles, hunting gear, and ornate furniture were ordered to design what the court euphemistically called marital aids: cushions, straps, supports, contraptions, half medical, half mechanical, were fashioned to make intimacy possible, or at least survivable. The secrecy around these devices was absolute. Each craftsman was sworn to silence under threat of death, and more than one disappeared under suspicious circumstances after their work was complete. Within the hidden chambers of the palace, a bizarre collection of padded pillows, leather restraints, and curved supports accumulated, an arsenal for the king's most private battles. But the true battleground was not his body. It was his mind. Ferdinand's shame festered into obsession. He studied the ancient statues of Greece and Rome, their male forms lean and refined, and felt himself mocked by marble. In that era, smaller anatomy was associated with nobility and refinement. His deformity marked him as grotesque, unworthy of the classical ideal. What modern men might envy became, in his time, a source of ridicule. He was a monster, not a man, and so paranoia thickened around him like smoke. He began to believe that the whispers about his condition were part of greater conspiracies, that every courtier's smirk, every diplomat's polite bow, carried hidden mockery. He came to see the entire world as a theatre laughing at his most intimate shame. The secret records, written by men who had examined him too closely, would one day be sealed in Vatican vaults. But Ferdinand carried them in his memory, etched into his paranoia. They were proof that his deformity was real and that others had seen, measured, and judged him. No humiliation could be more complete. And as Spain stumbled toward revolution and war, its future king nursed not just his shame, but the simmering rage it birthed. Rage that would soon consume wives, courtiers, subjects, and a nation desperate for stability. By the turn of the century, Ferdinand was of marriageable age. Spain, though rotting at its core, still held to the rituals of dynastic politics, and a suitable bride was chosen. Princess Maria Antonia of Naples and Sicily, his first cousin. The union was celebrated across Europe as a strengthening of Bourbon ties, a glittering alliance to reaffirm Spain's fragile dignity. The wedding of 1802 was a spectacle. Cathedral bells rang across Madrid, streets filled with cheering crowds, and nobles draped in gold-threaded finery thronged the palace halls. Maria Antonia, not yet 20, was radiant, dark eyes, delicate features, a girl raised on romantic tales of noble princes and gallant kings. She had heard Ferdinand called El Deseado, the desired one, by his supporters, and she clung to that flattering vision. Perhaps she would live her fairy tale, perhaps she would help guide Spain into a brighter future. Ferdinand, in public, played his part well. He bowed graciously, smiled stiffly, and carried himself with the awkward gallantry of a young man taught how to act, but not how to feel. To the crowds, they looked the perfect royal couple. To the courtiers, they looked at least respectable. But as the celebrations ended and the cathedral lights dimmed, reality prepared its cruel revelation. The first sign came in whispers from the Queen's attendants. The royal valet approached Maria Antonia's ladies-in-waiting with strange requests: specialized cushions, bottles of oil, straps, and padded contraptions to be delivered discreetly to the bridal chambers. The women, puzzled but obedient, complied, believing perhaps these were unusual Spanish customs. None of them imagined what awaited their mistress. That night, when Ferdinand stood before his bride unclothed, the illusion shattered. One lady-in-waiting would later write in a secret memoir, "Her Majesty screamed as though she had seen the devil himself. She pressed herself against the wall, shrieking, 'Monster! Monster!' until her voice broke." For Maria Antonia, sheltered and innocent, the sight was not only shocking, it was unimaginable. Ferdinand's body did not resemble the form of any man she had been led to expect. The monstrous size, the grotesque curvature, the unnatural growths, this was no symbol of virility, but a deformity so severe it bordered on the inhuman. What followed was less a wedding night than a medical procedure. Physicians, already standing by in anticipation of disaster, were summoned to calm the terrified princess. They explained the necessary preparations, the cushions that would hold Ferdinand's weight, the oils that would numb her pain. Laudanum was administered not for romance, but for survival. The consummation of this royal marriage became a grotesque ritual. Each attempt was choreographed by doctors and craftsmen, more like surgery than intimacy. Maria Antonia endured in silence, her body trembling, her spirit breaking. Ferdinand, already insecure, interpreted her horror not as the result of nature's cruelty, but as personal rejection. What should have been the beginning of companionship became the foundation of trauma. Maria Antonia began to wither inside the palace walls. The laudanum she had been given for her wedding night became her crutch, then her addiction. Each time the king summoned her to the chamber, the routine was the same. Physicians prepared the equipment, cushions were arranged, oils applied, and the young queen, dosed into a haze, was guided through an ordeal she dreaded with every fibre of her being. The palace whispered of her pallor, her hollow eyes, her sudden outbursts of tears. But no one dared speak openly. To suggest that the heir's marriage was a failure was treason. And so the suffering continued in silence, locked away behind gilded doors. Ferdinand's desperation only deepened. He convinced himself that if Maria Antonia could not bear a child, the fault lay not in his deformity, but in her reluctance, her fear, her weakness as a woman. He began to see her not as a partner, but as an obstacle to his destiny, an obstacle he would try in increasingly cruel ways to overcome. Thus began a marriage that would unravel into tragedy, a union not of love nor even of convenience, but of torment. The joyous wedding bells of Madrid had given way to muffled screams in the night, hidden by velvet curtains and drowned in laudanum. Spain, though unaware, was watching the birth of a nightmare, not only for a young queen, but for an entire kingdom that would soon be ruled by a man whose shame had curdled into cruelty. In the months that followed her wedding night, Maria Antonia's life became a silent nightmare. What began as terror turned into routine, and routine into despair. The laudanum, at first prescribed as a mercy, soon became her only refuge. Each dose dulled the edge of fear, blunted her pain, and numbed the reality of her marital obligations. But it also chained her to an addiction that grew stronger. With every night, Ferdinand summoned her to the chamber. The pattern was unchanging. The king would call, physicians would enter first, like attendants to some grim theatre. They arranged the special cushions, lubricated the oils, placed straps and supports as though preparing an operating table. Maria Antonia was led in trembling, her ladies already prepared with the bitter draught that would dull her senses. Only then would Ferdinand appear, as if conducting a grotesque ritual rather than sharing a bed with his wife. For the young queen, intimacy became indistinguishable from torture. Witnesses wrote of her pale face, her vacant eyes, her trembling hands. She endured, but each session left her weaker, more brittle, a ghost of the vibrant princess who had once dreamed of fairy tales. To the court, her health was blamed on a delicate constitution. Behind closed doors, everyone knew the truth. Still, there was duty. Spain awaited an heir. Month after month, the court watched anxiously for signs of pregnancy. And when at last Maria Antonia conceived, the palace filled with hope. Perhaps the ordeal had meaning, perhaps Spain's suffering queen would give birth to stability. But the pregnancy ended in miscarriage. The queen, racked with grief and pain, nearly died herself. Ferdinand's reaction was telling. Rather than show compassion, he grew bitter, convinced his wife's revulsion had somehow sabotaged conception. He muttered that her fear was an act of defiance, that she failed in her duty as queen. To him, her trauma was not tragedy, but betrayal. From that moment, his cruelty hardened. He demanded new methods, new instruments, new rituals to ensure success. Palace artisans were commissioned to craft restraints, silken straps that would hold the queen in place, preventing her from recoiling or turning away. He began to consult not just physicians but astrologers and mystics. Charts were drawn to align their attempts with the stars. He convinced himself that her resistance was spiritual and that only the right cosmic alignment could break her body's refusal. Maria Antonia, caught between her husband's paranoia and her own despair, withdrew into prayer. She begged for forgiveness, though she could not name the sin. She clutched rosaries until her hands bled, whispering that she was cursed. And when prayer no longer comforted her, she reached for the laudanum bottle. At first to endure, then to escape, then simply to survive another day. Those around her watched in helpless silence. Ladies in waiting described her eyes, once bright, becoming glassy, unfocused, the eyes of someone living more in dreams than in life. Servants whispered that the queen drifted through the palace like an apparition, appearing suddenly in corridors without purpose, murmuring fragments of hymns under her breath. Ferdinand, blind to the wreckage, grew only more determined. In his mind, he was not the cause of her decline, he was its victim. He told his confidants that his wife was weak, that her body resisted his royal essence, that she might even be conspiring to deny Spain an heir. The cruelty of his condition had twisted into cruelty of character. By the end of those years, Maria Antonia was no longer a wife, nor even a queen, but a vessel, drugged, restrained, and broken, yet still forced into service of a king's obsession. And as the bottles of laudanum piled in her chamber, and the whispers of servants turned into fearful silence, one truth grew unavoidable. The queen's life was slipping away, drained by marriage, poisoned by despair. Spain still waited for an heir. Ferdinand still demanded one. But in the gilded prison of the palace, the young queen was slowly dissolving into shadows. The palace had grown accustomed to whispers of pregnancy, only to be silenced by tragedy. Maria Antonia conceived twice during her brief marriage to Ferdinand, and each time the court dared to hope. Each time Spain held its breath, imagining the birth of an heir who might stabilize a crumbling dynasty, and each time those hopes collapsed into grief. The first miscarriage came in 1804. Maria Antonia was 4 months pregnant when the bleeding began. Physicians rushed to her chambers, but their faces betrayed their helplessness. They spoke of a fragile constitution, of natural weakness, but everyone knew what they could not say aloud. The violent trauma of her marital ordeals had left her body too damaged to carry life. The Queen lost the child, and with it whatever remained of her fragile hope. Still, duty demanded she try again. Ferdinand's desperation deepened. He scrutinized her every movement, convinced that her revulsion, her trembling, her very fear of him was the cause of failure. He sought remedies from astrologers, potions from alchemists, and even rituals from wandering mystics who promised divine intervention. At his command, the royal bedchamber became an alchemical stage, incense burning, charts of stars laid upon tables, strange chants echoing in the corridors. Maria Antonia, drugged and restrained, endured it all in silence. In 1805 she conceived again. This time the palace dared to believe. The Queen's belly swelled, and Spain's streets buzzed with anticipation. But the hope was short-lived. In her 8th month, labor began with a torrent of blood. Witnesses described a night of horror, screams echoing through stone corridors, midwives frantic, physicians barking orders. Hours passed in agony. When at last the ordeal ended, there was only silence. The infant was dead. Maria Antonia survived, but barely. The Queen never recovered. Her body weakened, but worse, her spirit fractured completely. What modern doctors would call trauma and addiction, her contemporaries described as melancholia profunda. She drifted between prayers and laudanum dreams, between whispered apologies to God and vacant stares that frightened even her closest attendants. She seemed to believe she was cursed, that God himself rejected her womb. Ferdinand's response was not compassion. He grew harsher, his paranoia sharper. He accused his wife of sabotaging the pregnancies, of moving deliberately in ways that would cause miscarriage, of poisoning herself to thwart his dynasty. To him, every tragedy was her betrayal, never his burden. By 1806, Maria Antonia was a ghost haunting the palace, 21 years old and already destroyed. Her body trembled with the effects of opiates, her voice often incoherent from the haze. Servants whispered she prayed through the night, begging forgiveness for sins she could not name. Some said she believed she had been chosen as a vessel of divine punishment, that her suffering was Spain's penance for generations of sin. On May 25, 1807, she died. The official record listed her cause as fever, a vague explanation meant to quiet questions. But everyone who had seen her knew the truth. She had died of despair, poisoned not by enemies, but by her own misery. A queen consumed by shame, broken by her husband's monstrous obsession, and wasted by the drugs that dulled her agony. Yet even in death she found no peace. Rumors swirled almost immediately. Some whispered that she had been poisoned, not by outside conspirators, but by Ferdinand himself, who had tired of her failures and wanted a new bride. When the palace apothecary was found dead days later, leaving behind a letter that vanished into Ferdinand's agent's hands, suspicion hardened into legend. Was it a confession, a record of secret poisons, or evidence of the king's condition, too dangerous to reveal? No one ever knew. In public, Ferdinand displayed grief, as etiquette demanded. He bowed his head at the funeral, eyes glistening for the crowd. But in private, those closest to him noted something colder, something nearer to relief. Within weeks he was already considering new marriage prospects. His wife had been discarded like a broken vessel, another casualty of his deformity, another shadow in a palace already heavy with ghosts. Spain, too, was haunted. For the first time, the nation saw that the king's personal curse might not remain confined to the bedchamber. His shame, his cruelty, his obsession with heirs had destroyed a queen. Soon it would consume far more than that. Maria Antonia's death should have softened Ferdinand, left him reflective, broken by grief. But grief was a language he never understood. Instead, her absence freed him. He no longer had to endure her screams, her laudanum haze, or the constant reminder of his own failure as a man. And so, even as her body was lowered into the ground, Ferdinand was already plotting, not for love, not for family, but for power. By 1807, Spain was crumbling. Charles IV, Ferdinand's father, was little more than a shadow of a king. Gentle, indecisive, and more interested in hunting than ruling, he had surrendered his crown's authority to Manuel de Godoy, the infamous favourite of Queen Maria Louisa. Godoy was clever, ambitious, and despised. To many Spaniards he embodied corruption itself, a man of low birth elevated far above his station, who wielded the king's authority while the monarch fumbled with muskets and falcons. Ferdinand despised Godoy not only for usurping power, but for embodying everything Ferdinand envied. Godoy was charismatic, vigorous, and rumoured to be the queen's lover. He moved with confidence in the palace where Ferdinand skulked in shadows. To the young prince, Godoy was not merely an enemy. He was a mirror of what Ferdinand could never be. Around Ferdinand gathered a circle of nobles, officers, and clerics who shared his hatred of Godoy. They called themselves Los Fernandinos. To them, Ferdinand was not the broken man of whispers and deformities, but El Deseado, the desired one, the saviour who would restore Spain's honour. They spread pamphlets lauding his supposed wisdom, his piety, his patriotism. They painted him as a reformer who would cleanse the corruption that stained his father's reign. It was propaganda, but it worked. Across Spain, people weary of Charles IV and disgusted with Godoy began to look to Ferdinand with cautious hope. The prince, so often mocked in private, was now praised in public as the nation's future. He basked in it, his paranoia soothed by adoration, his resentment fed by the whispers of loyalty that filled his halls. But Ferdinand's allies misunderstood him. They believed they were grooming a pliable figurehead, a prince they could manipulate into power while they ruled in his name. What they did not grasp was that Ferdinand's paranoia had already hardened into cruelty. He trusted no one, not friends, not priests, not even the conspirators who risked everything for him. To Ferdinand, loyalty was never sincere. It was merely a mask, and he would strip it away the moment it suited him. The conspiracy reached its peak in October 1807. The Fernandinos plotted to overthrow Charles IV, expose Godoy, and place Ferdinand on the throne. But their plan was clumsy, riddled with betrayal before it began. The El Escorial conspiracy, as it became known, was uncovered almost immediately. Godoy intercepted their communications, and the royal family confronted Ferdinand with evidence of treason against his own father. In that moment, the mask slipped. Ferdinand, the would-be saviour of Spain, revealed himself as something far smaller, far pettier. Instead of standing by his allies, instead of accepting the role of martyr or revolutionary, he collapsed into cowardice. He begged his parents' forgiveness, grovelling before the very people he had plotted against. He named names, detailed plans, exposed every conspirator in exchange for his own survival. The men who had risked everything for him were imprisoned, exiled, or disgraced. Ferdinand, their desired one, had betrayed them all without hesitation. He survived, but at the cost of trust. The nobility learned that Ferdinand's loyalty was a myth. His courage was a facade, his word was worthless, yet the irony was bitter. For even in his betrayal, Ferdinand remained a symbol. To the people of Spain, weary of corruption and humiliation, he still appeared as the innocent prince persecuted by a vile favorite. Godoy's unpopularity was so immense that Ferdinand's cowardice could be spun as victimhood. The pamphlets continued to circulate. The myth of El Deseado endured. But those who had seen him in that moment, trembling, snivelling, offering up his friends like sacrificial lambs, understood the truth. This was no savior. This was a man twisted by shame, paranoia, and cruelty. A man who would rule not with vision, but with vengeance. Maria Antonia had been the first to be destroyed by Ferdinand's deformity and resentment. Now Spain itself would feel his shadow spreading across its throne. Even as Ferdinand betrayed his allies and clawed his way closer to power, another betrayal was unfolding within his own body. Physicians noted with alarm that his deformity was not static. It was growing, changing shape, swelling in unnatural ways, as if his anatomy were mocking him with each passing year. What had once been an oddity was becoming an outright monstrosity. In secret consultations, doctors whispered about possible causes. Some suggested a rare hormonal disorder that drove unchecked growth, a condition modern medicine would later call macrophalia. Others believed it was a curse of the bloodline, the grotesque culmination of centuries of inbreeding. Whatever the explanation, the reality was the same. Ferdinand's condition was worsening. Intimacy, already a nightmare, was becoming nearly impossible. The palace workshops became a theatre of desperate ingenuity. Craftsmen, sworn to silence under penalty of death, laboured on devices more elaborate than anything conceived for his first marriage. They built adjustable cushions padded with velvet, contraptions of leather and silk meant to hold his body in place, curved supports that could redirect weight. What began as marital aids now resembled the instruments of some secret torture chamber. The line between medicine and cruelty blurred in the flickering light of those hidden rooms. And yet, all the artifice in the world could not conceal the truth. Ferdinand's partners, maids, courtiers, and eventually wives, were left broken by the encounters. Physicians reported tearing, bleeding, fainting. One midwife, bribed into silence, confided years later that she had never witnessed suffering so profound in a royal bedchamber. For those unfortunate enough to be summoned by the prince, intimacy was a sentence rather than a privilege. Rumours, once confined to whispers in palace corridors, began to drift into the salons of Europe. Diplomats carried back stories of the Spanish heir's monstrous secret. They were careful not to put the details in official correspondence. No one dared put such scandal in ink, but letters written in cipher and gossip shared in confidence spoke of a prince cursed by nature, unfit for his duty as husband and father. The ridicule stung Ferdinand to his core. He began to suspect that every laugh in his presence, every polite smile, was a mockery of his shame. His paranoia deepened. He kept lists of those he believed had seen too much, heard too much, whispered too much. Some disappeared quietly, reassigned to distant postings or dismissed from court. Others were punished more directly. A chambermaid who dared to giggle after being summoned to his chamber was beaten and sent away. A court musician who spread jokes about the royal deformity was arrested on charges of treason. But cruelty did not stop the whispers. If anything, it spread them further. The story of Ferdinand's body became a European curiosity, an unspoken scandal that both horrified and amused. In the drawing rooms of Paris and Vienna, his name became synonymous with grotesque deformity. Behind his back, he was no longer el deseado, the desired one. He was el monstruo. The physical deformity fed his psychological one. Ferdinand's cruelty became more calculated, his paranoia more suffocating. He grew convinced that his curse was not natural, but inflicted by enemies, by God, by conspirators who wanted to rob him of heirs. He demanded new remedies, new rituals, new protections. He consumed strange powders, endured painful procedures, and demanded prayers from priests who no longer knew what to say. Nothing helped. Spain was entering a storm, political collapse, foreign invasion, revolution, and yet its future king was consumed not with statecraft, but with the monstrous burden between his legs. While his body twisted further into grotesquerie, his mind followed. And in this grotesque union of flesh and paranoia, a tyrant was being fully formed. The year was 1808 and Spain was collapsing. Napoleon's armies marched across the Iberian Peninsula, shattering what little dignity remained of the Bourbon monarchy. Charles V abdicated in panic. Ferdinand, hailed briefly by the people as their deliverer, was swept into power, only to be humiliated almost instantly. Lured to Bayonne under the pretense of negotiation, he found himself stripped of his crown and made a prisoner of France. Thus began 6 years of captivity for the desired one. Yet for Ferdinand, exile was no mere political misfortune. It was an anatomical humiliation played out under the cold gaze of foreign doctors. At the Château de Valençay, where Napoleon confined him, French physicians were summoned to examine the curious case of the Spanish king. Unlike his own court physicians, who cloaked their notes in euphemism and dread, the French doctors approached him with clinical detachment. To them, he was not a monarch to be feared, but a specimen to be studied. They measured, prodded, and recorded, leaving behind reports that centuries later would astonish historians. They described an organ of such grotesque size and shape that it seemed more mythological than human, with abnormalities that defied classification. One wrote, "The deformity is not merely physical but functional. Marital union, in the ordinary sense, is a mechanical impossibility without contrivances of a most unusual kind." Another concluded bluntly, "Nature has here produced a curiosity, not a man." These examinations were torture to Ferdinand. In Spain, his condition was a whispered secret. In France, it was dissected like a laboratory oddity. He who once silenced courtiers with fear was now stripped of power, reduced to a body under scrutiny. And he knew with gnawing certainty, that Napoleon had gathered every detail. French intelligence held dossiers thicker than scripture, recording not just his betrayals and politics, but his most intimate shame. Yet while Ferdinand raged in captivity, Spain bled for him. Across the mountains and cities, guerrilla fighters gave their lives under the banner of restoring their king. Peasants starved, soldiers died, villages burned, all for the hope of bringing back the desired one. They imagined him noble, steadfast, suffering for Spain's salvation. In reality, their monarch spent his exile drafting desperate letters to European courts, begging for brides who might endure his monstrous affliction. The irony was bitter. While men sacrificed their lives in muddy trenches to restore him, Ferdinand obsessed over cushions, potions, and the mechanics of conception. Spain burned. Its king plotted wedding nights. Yet captivity did not soften him. If anything, it hardened his paranoia. Isolated, humiliated, and convinced that the world mocked him, Ferdinand's resentment festered like an open wound. He brooded over betrayals real and imagined. He rehearsed revenge against enemies, seen and unseen. Every humiliation etched itself deeper into his character, twisting him further into the tyrant he would become. When Napoleon finally fell and Ferdinand was restored in 1814, Spain greeted him with delirious joy. Crowds wept, showering his carriage with flowers. Children kissed his hands. Peasants knelt in the mud. To them he was the saviour returned. But as Ferdinand waved from his carriage, smiling faintly, his mind was elsewhere. He was not thinking of Spain's future, nor of rewarding the sacrifices of those who had bled for him. He was thinking of the palace bedchamber, of new devices to be fashioned, of physicians to be consulted, of wives to be found. For Ferdinand's greatest battle was never against Napoleon, nor against rebels, nor even against his people. It was against his own body, and it was a battle he would drag all of Spain into, whether they willed it or not. In the spring of 1814, Ferdinand crossed back into Spain, and the nation erupted in ecstasy. 6 years of blood and sacrifice had been poured into the struggle against Napoleon, and now the desired one had returned. His carriage was smothered in flowers, peasants knelt in the streets, children clutched his hands and sobbed with joy. To the starving, battered people of Spain, their king was not merely a monarch, he was salvation itself, the living proof that their suffering had meaning. The scenes of adoration were unlike anything Europe had seen. Cities erupted in spontaneous festivals. Priests proclaimed him God's chosen. Widows of the war held up their dead sons' uniforms as offerings to the king they had restored. Ferdinand, in his stiff, awkward manner, waved and bowed, smiling thinly as though humbled by such love. But inside he felt something darker, something intoxicating, vindication. The same people who once whispered about his deformity now wept at his feet. Their faith was proof that he had triumphed, not over France, not over fate, but over mockery itself. Yet beneath the pageantry, Spain was in ruins. Fields lay fallow, villages reduced to ash, and the treasury bled dry. The Constitution of 1812, Spain's fragile experiment in liberal reform, was still warm from the press. Many believed Ferdinand would embrace it, would rule as a constitutional monarch in gratitude for the sacrifices made in his name. The people dreamed of liberty bound to tradition, of progress secured by the king they adored. But Ferdinand was not thinking of constitutions, he was thinking of his bedchamber. Within days of his return, he issued a decree annulling the Constitution of 1812. The liberals who had drafted it were hunted down, imprisoned, or executed. Ferdinand made it clear he would rule not as a limited monarch, but as an absolute king. The hopes of Spain's reformers were strangled in the cradle, replaced by the iron grip of a man who trusted no one. And still, he smiled to the crowds. To the world he was the humble saviour. In private, he was already retreating into obsession. His first order to his physicians was not about famine relief or rebuilding, but about new aids to make intimacy less catastrophic. His next concern was not foreign policy, but foreign brides. He summoned artisans from across Europe, German metalworkers, Italian upholsterers, Ottoman specialists rumoured to craft devices for sultans, and tasked them with perfecting the arsenal of supports and instruments that had already become infamous among his closest attendants. Spain had bled to restore its king, and its king's first priority was once again his monstrous body. The contradiction was unbearable. On the streets, Spaniards still kissed his portraits and cheered his name. In the palace, courtiers whispered that the king's nights were filled with screams, not of pleasure, but of terror from the women forced into his arms. Servants carried bloodied sheets through secret corridors. Physicians burned notes rather than risk discovery of what they had seen. The first years of Ferdinand's restored reign came to be known as La Década Ominosa, the ominous decade. Historians speak of it as a period of repression and cruelty, a reign that strangled liberty and silenced reform. But for those inside the palace, the ominousness was far more literal. The shadow of the king's obsession loomed over every chamber, over every marriage negotiation, over every woman who entered his orbit. Spain had welcomed back its savior. Instead, it had enthroned its tormentor. In 1816, Ferdinand remarried. His choice, or rather the dynastic arrangement engineered for him, was another cousin, Maria Isabel of Portugal. 19 years old, soft-faced and naive, she arrived in Madrid with the hopeful glow of a young bride, raised on tales of royal romance. She had been briefed, of course, about her duty to provide an heir. But no briefing could prepare her for what awaited on her wedding night. The wedding itself was magnificent. The cathedral blazed with candles, choirs sang until the vaults trembled, and the nobility paraded in jewels to dazzle foreign ambassadors. To the watching crowds, the union seemed a promise of renewal. Spain, ruined by war and repression, would now have the chance of a new queen, a new dynasty, perhaps even stability. Ferdinand himself looked almost regal in cloth of gold vestments, though those who studied his face closely noted a thin sheen of sweat, the nervous twitch of a man whose thoughts were not on the altar, but on the chamber that awaited him. That night, in the palace, the illusion shattered. The preparations were as strange as they were chilling. Once again, the special cushions were brought in, bottles of oils placed discreetly by the bed, and implements that looked more medical than marital arranged in readiness. Maria Isabel, confused but dutiful, was reassured by her ladies-in-waiting that these were customs of the Spanish court. She could not know she was stepping into a ritual of pain. When Ferdinand revealed himself, her reaction echoed that of Maria Antonia years before. She did not scream, but she froze, trembling, unable to comprehend what she saw. What followed was not the consummation of marriage, but a scene of terror. The screams that did break the silence were heard by servants in distant corridors. Blood stained the linens. Furniture was broken in the struggle to make an impossible act possible. Maria Isabel survived, but not unscathed. The next morning her ladies reported she spoke in a halting voice, stuttering where once her speech had been clear. Her hands trembled. She flinched whenever the king entered the room. Soon the young queen developed what physicians of the time called hysterical fits, seizures, fainting spells, uncontrollable sobbing. Today we would call it trauma. Ferdinand predictably saw none of this as his fault. To him, his wife's horror was insult. Her stammer, her avoidance, her tears, all were signs of betrayal, perhaps even conspiracy. He began to suspect her of mocking him in secret, of conspiring with foreign powers to humiliate him. He ordered her letters intercepted, her food tested for poison, her servants interrogated. The palace became a prison where Maria Isabel was both captive and experiment. And the experiments continued. Physicians, summoned at all hours, devised new contraptions, new postures, new remedies to ease the impossible union. Ferdinand, restless and obsessed, consulted not only doctors but travelling specialists, anatomists from Germany, alchemists from Italy, even rumoured performers from travelling circuses who claimed expertise in unusual physical conditions. Each offered advice, each failed. For Maria Isabel, life became a waking nightmare. Witnesses said she would wake screaming from her sleep, crying "the monster," as if pursued by a vision too terrible to name. Her body withered under the strain, her cheeks hollowed, her eyes grew wide and vacant. She walked the palace like a ghost, just as Maria Antonia had before her. Meanwhile, Spain endured its own nightmare. While colonies in the Americas burned with revolution, while treasuries emptied and armies faltered, Ferdinand poured his energy into his bedroom horrors. His obsession with heirs consumed him more than governing ever did. The second Queen of Spain, like the first, was being ground into despair by a marriage that resembled a form of torture more than a union. And the nation, though it cheered her arrival, soon whispered of her decline, of her fading smile, of the shadow in her eyes. Maria Isabel had come to Madrid with hope. She would leave it broken, another victim of a king whose curse poisoned not only his wives but an entire realm. By 1817, the Spanish royal palace had become something grotesque, not a home, not even a court, but a laboratory. What should have been the private realm of love and lineage was transformed into a theatre of experimentation, where physicians, artisans, and even charlatans were summoned to address one man's impossible curse. Ferdinand's desperation for an heir grew with each passing month of Maria Isabel's decline. Every miscarriage in the past, every scream in the bridal chamber, every whisper of mockery in foreign courts gnawed at him. To the king, producing a child was not just duty, it was proof he was not the monster his body suggested. And so he demanded solutions, no matter how bizarre. Physicians proposed procedures that bordered on barbarism. They drew sketches of devices resembling instruments of torture, harnesses of steel and silk, padded frames meant to position the queen as though she were a patient on an operating table. The king ordered them built. Court artisans, men once renowned for crafting the finest saddles and armor, now labored in secret chambers, forging marital contraptions. Their workshops became filled with half-medical, half-mechanical creations, contraptions that might just as easily belong to an inquisitor as to a doctor. And the trials were not confined to doctors alone. Ferdinand, in his mania, summoned foreign experts. German anatomists, French physicians, even itinerant performers who claimed to know tricks of the body were brought in. One account whispers of a contortionist from Italy invited to advise on postures that might circumvent the king's deformity. Another speaks of an Ottoman specialist smuggled into Madrid at night, rumoured to have crafted devices for sultans with unusual appetites. These men studied Ferdinand like a specimen, then prescribed methods that were humiliating, invasive, and always futile. Maria Isabel, caught in the centre of this theatre, began to disintegrate. Each experiment meant another night of restraints, of painful attempts supervised by watchful physicians and the king's impatient glare. Her body weakened. She lost weight until her gowns hung loose upon her frame. Her voice, once gentle, fractured into a permanent stammer. Her eyes grew vacant, as if she had withdrawn to some distant place inside herself. Her ladies-in-waiting whispered that she was haunted by visions. She would wake in the night shrieking, clawing at her bedclothes, crying out warnings about a monster that stalked her dreams. Sometimes she collapsed without warning, trembling on the floor in what physicians diagnosed as hysterical seizures. Today, we would call them trauma responses. But for Ferdinand, her terror was nothing but another insult. He grew convinced that Maria Isabel was conspiring against him, mocking him in secret letters to Lisbon, plotting with foreign powers to destroy his dignity. He ordered her chambers searched for hidden messages, her correspondence intercepted, her servants interrogated. Paranoia, already deep in his blood, metastasized until even his queen was seen as a traitor. What the palace endured in those years was a cycle of horror, failed experiments, screams behind closed doors, whispered prayers for mercy, and the king's endless thirst for control. The queen's body was no longer her own. It was a subject in a grotesque medical study, conducted not for her health, but for her husband's ego. By 1818, Maria Isabel had wasted away almost entirely. The physicians called it nervous exhaustion. The servants whispered suicide. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. She was dead, 21 years old, another broken bride, sacrificed to Ferdinand's deformity. Her death sent a chill through the palace. Two queens gone before their time, both consumed by the same nightmare. Yet Ferdinand did not grieve as others grieved. He raged. He demanded autopsies, ordered multiple physicians to cut into her body searching for poison. He accused her attendants of treachery, arrested her closest ladies-in-waiting, and interrogated them until they broke down in terror. To him, her death was not the consequence of his cruelty, but the work of conspirators. At her funeral, Ferdinand insisted on viewing her body again and again, touching her lifeless skin, muttering about betrayal. He had her death mask cast in plaster and kept it in his private chambers. Courtiers whispered that he spoke to it in the dead of night, as though his broken queen could still answer him. Spain, watching from afar, saw only the public pageantry, the solemn funeral, the king's bowed head, the black-draped cathedral. But inside the palace, servants whispered in horror, another queen destroyed, another ghost added to the growing collection haunting Madrid's royal halls. By 1819, Ferdinand was a twice-widowed king, his reputation already stained across Europe. Two young queens had entered his palace full of hope, and both had left in coffins. The courts of Europe whispered of Madrid as a place of doom, a gilded prison where brides became martyrs. Few dynasties wished to risk another daughter in such a union. But dynastic desperation often outweighs fear, and so a third match was arranged. Maria Josepha Amalia of Saxony. Maria Josepha was 24, older than Ferdinand's previous wives, and raised in a court where whispers of his reputation had already spread. Unlike Maria Antonia or Maria Isabel, she did not arrive with naive expectations of romance. She was prepared, briefed not with vague euphemisms but with detailed warnings. Her Saxon physicians had consulted with Spanish doctors. She brought with her medical supplies, specialized garments, and even a personal physician versed in what her family delicately called marital challenges. The wedding itself was subdued. Gone was the roaring celebration of Ferdinand's first marriage, or the solemn grandeur of the second. Europe no longer regarded Ferdinand as a fairy tale prince, but as a dangerous husband. The guests were fewer, the celebrations muted. Some ambassadors even avoided attending, muttering that Spain's marriage negotiations had become little more than diplomacy cloaked in cruelty. On their wedding night, Maria Josepha approached her role with the detachment of a clinician. She submitted to preparations, instructed her ladies to assist with the contraptions, and endured the ritual as though it were a medical experiment rather than a marital union. She kept notes, precise, clinical, unemotional, on what worked, what failed, what needed altering. Unlike her predecessors, who had recoiled in horror, she approached Ferdinand as though he were a case study, a grotesque but solvable puzzle. At first, this gave Ferdinand hope. Perhaps here, at last, was a woman who would not scream, who would not collapse into terror, who would endure him without breaking. But as the weeks passed, that hope curdled into resentment. Maria Josepha's calm acceptance, her refusal to be shocked, felt to Ferdinand like mockery. He began to suspect that she did not see him as a husband at all, but as a curiosity to be documented, a specimen to be analyzed and reported back to Saxony. His paranoia deepened. He accused her of sending coded messages in her letters, of plotting with foreign doctors to reveal his secret. He demanded her personal physician be watched, her correspondence intercepted, her attendants interrogated. Once again, the Queen of Spain was treated not as a wife but as a suspect in an endless conspiracy. Meanwhile, Spain itself was unraveling. Ferdinand's obsession with heirs consumed his energy while the empire burned. In the Americas, colonies broke away one after another. Mexico, Colombia, Chile, Peru, all declaring independence. The wealth that had sustained Spain for centuries drained across the Atlantic, never to return. At home, famine spread, uprisings flared, and the treasury emptied. Ministers begged the king to act, but he postponed council meetings, cancelled audiences, and delayed decrees while he consulted doctors about his deformity and engineers about new devices. The palace had become a grotesque mirror of the kingdom. As Spain withered, Ferdinand pursued his impossible quest, summoning artisans to design new supports, demanding rituals, prayers, and experimental procedures. Maria Josefa submitted without protest, recording the ordeals in her journals with the detached tone of a physician. But she too was breaking. Her letters home reveal a woman slowly dissolving, writing of life as duty without affection, without hope. The world outside the palace mocked Spain. Revolutionary pamphlets across the Americas depicted Ferdinand as a tyrant, not only politically impotent, but sexually crippled. Satirical cartoons showed him as a bloated figure weighed down by chains, or worse, as a monstrous caricature of his deformity. His private shame had become public ridicule, woven into the propaganda of independence movements. By the mid-1820s, Ferdinand's reign was in freefall. He had no heir, no victories, no glory. Only a crumbling empire and a queen who endured him with cold detachment. The irony was unbearable. Maria Josefa had survived longer than his other wives precisely because she treated him not with fear, not with love, but with the distance of science. Yet that very distance drove Ferdinand mad. He did not want a scientist's gaze. He wanted validation, desire, proof that he was not the monster whispered about in every court of Europe. But validation never came. And in the end, even Maria Josefa, pragmatic and disciplined as she was, would not escape the curse of being married to Ferdinand VII. For nearly a decade, Maria Josefa endured her role as queen with the grim patience of a physician tending a hopeless patient. The union was clinical, loveless, and humiliating, yet it continued, each attempt carefully documented, each failure recorded. And then, against all odds, in 1829 the impossible happened. Maria Josefa was pregnant. The news struck the court like thunder. Spain, battered by wars and revolutions, erupted in joy. At last, the king would have an heir. Church bells rang across the land, and proclamations declared the pregnancy a sign of divine favor. Pamphlets celebrated Ferdinand as a monarch chosen by God, his curse finally lifted. The people rejoiced as though salvation itself had entered the Queen's womb. For Ferdinand, the pregnancy was more than hope. It was vindication. Years of humiliation, whispers of impotence, the mockery of his deformity, all could now be silenced by the cry of a newborn child. He threw himself into obsession, not with governing Spain, but with protecting the miracle growing inside Maria Josefa. Guards were doubled around her chambers, priests were summoned daily to bless her body and pray over her womb. Physicians from across Europe were called to Madrid, each offering conflicting advice, each terrified to disappoint a king whose paranoia bordered on madness. Ferdinand demanded control over every detail: what the Queen ate, when she rested, how she walked. Meals were inspected and tasted for poison, her correspondence intercepted, her ladies-in-waiting interrogated. And yet, amid the chaos, there were ominous signs. By the 7th month, Maria Josefa began to suffer complications, bleeding, pain, and exhaustion. Today, doctors would recognize placental abruption, a dangerous condition that could have been managed with care. But Ferdinand's interference made proper treatment impossible. He would not allow foreign physicians to act without his consent, nor would he permit the simplest procedures without consulting mystics and alchemists. At night, he ordered strange rituals, incense burned, relics pressed against the Queen's stomach, whispered prayers mixed with superstitious chants. On May 18, 1829, disaster struck. Maria Josepha went into premature labor. The palace filled with panic as physicians and midwives rushed to her bedside. Ferdinand, in his mania, insisted on being present, barking orders despite having no knowledge of medicine. Hours of agony followed, a night of screams and blood that horrified even the hardened attendants. The baby was born, a girl, frail and silent. She lived only a few hours before slipping away, her tiny body unable to endure. Maria Josepha, shattered by blood loss and infection, lingered for 3 weeks. Her decline was slow, agonizing, and watched with growing horror by her attendants. When at last she succumbed, the court announced it as childbed fever. In truth, it was a death born of mismanagement, despair, and neglect. For Ferdinand, the loss was catastrophic. Yet he did not mourn as a husband or father. Instead, he spiraled into denial and rage. He refused to allow the bodies of his wife and daughter to be buried. For days they lay in their chambers, the air thick with the stench of decay, while Ferdinand ordered his physicians to attempt resuscitation. He demanded prayers for resurrection, ordered holy relics to be laid on the corpses, and accused his attendants of sabotage when nature refused to reverse itself. Only when the bodies had decayed beyond concealment did he relent. Maria Josepha and her infant daughter were buried with solemn pomp, the nation grieving for a miracle that had turned into horror. Ferdinand, meanwhile, withdrew into his chambers, surrounding himself with death masks of all 3 wives he had destroyed. Visitors reported that he spoke to them as though they were still alive, whispering apologies, or worse, accusations of betrayal. Spain, once again, had been dragged into the vortex of its king's private curse. The miracle pregnancy that might have restored the dynasty had instead deepened the nightmare. The empire continued to crumble, colonies gone, the treasury empty, the people starving. And still, Ferdinand obsessed not with governance, but with the chamber where every queen became a ghost. The kingdom had waited decades for an heir. Instead, it had received another coffin, another funeral, another shadow over a reign already drowning in darkness. By late 1829, Ferdinand was 45, ailing, paranoid, and consumed by failure. He had buried 3 wives, each destroyed by his deformity and his obsession, and he had no heir. Spain was collapsing, torn by revolutions abroad and unrest at home. Ministers whispered that the dynasty itself was at risk. The Bourbons, once rulers of an empire, stood on the edge of extinction. And so, out of desperation, rather than hope, a 4th marriage was arranged. The bride was Maria Cristina of Naples and Sicily, ironically another cousin, drawn from the same tangled web of Bourbon blood that had cursed Ferdinand from birth. She was 23, vivacious, and far more politically astute than her predecessors. But unlike them, she carried a secret. When Maria Cristina arrived in Madrid, she was already pregnant, not by Ferdinand, but by another man, a Neapolitan officer whose name was whispered but never officially recorded. The arrangement was clear to those who orchestrated it. Ferdinand was failing, Spain needed an heir, and Maria Cristina's unborn child would be passed off as his. The wedding was hurried, stripped of pomp. The king, bloated and sickly, stood at the altar beside his young bride, her belly already swelling beneath her gown. The courtiers bowed, priests mumbled blessings, but everyone in the cathedral knew the truth. This was no marriage of love, nor even of alliance. It was a farce, a last desperate gamble to preserve the Bourbon line. Ferdinand, astonishingly, embraced the deception. Whether through self-delusion, desperation, or cynical acceptance, he convinced himself that Maria Cristina's pregnancy was divine providence, that God had granted him an heir, even if the mechanics defied reason. He clung to this fiction with fanatic zeal, forbidding anyone to question it. To speak otherwise was treason. In 1830, Maria Cristina gave birth to a daughter, Isabella. The infant was declared the legitimate child of Ferdinand VII, the future Queen Isabella II of Spain. Cannons roared, bells rang, and proclamations spread across the kingdom. At last, Spain had its heir. But legitimacy is a fragile thing, and Ferdinand knew it. His paranoia, already legendary, grew unbearable. He oscillated between adoring the infant as his miracle and resenting her as proof of his failure. At times he gazed at her for hours, searching her tiny face for traces of his own features. At other times he raged in private, convinced that she was the child of betrayal. His relationship with Maria Cristina became a labyrinth of suspicion. He watched her constantly, bursting into her chambers at night with armed guards, convinced she was hiding lovers. He had peepholes drilled into the walls between their apartments so he could spy on her every move. Servants reported seeing the king's eye pressed to these crude apertures, glaring at his young wife as she prayed, nursed, or simply sat in silence. To maintain the illusion of legitimacy, Ferdinand resumed his grotesque attempts at intimacy. Once again, the cushions, the oils, the contraptions reappeared. Physicians hovered in the shadows, documenting each humiliating attempt. Maria Cristina endured, her face calm in public, but her letters to her family in Naples betraying her despair. She described herself as living in a glass cage, watched always, trusted never, forced to play the part of a queen while enduring the life of a prisoner. Ferdinand's obsession with heirs had not ended with Isabella. He insisted on continuing the charade, desperate to father a child of his own blood. Each attempt pushed Maria Cristina closer to collapse. The cycle of laudanum, restraints, and failed intimacy repeated once more in Madrid, as it had with every queen before her. Yet Maria Cristina was not Maria Antonia, nor Maria Isabel, nor Maria Josefa. She was shrewder, more calculating. She understood that survival in this palace required more than endurance. It required political cunning. While Ferdinand raged and spied, she quietly built alliances among courtiers, bishops, and foreign ambassadors. She would need them, for she sensed that Ferdinand's reign was nearing its end, and the true battle would begin the moment he was gone. The birth of Isabella had saved the Bourbon line, at least for now. But it had also trapped Maria Cristina in the same nightmare that had destroyed her predecessors. Ferdinand's body had cursed 3 queens before her. Now it turned its gaze on her. And though she survived where they had perished, she would carry scars not written in flesh, but in the constant terror of being married to a king whose paranoia devoured everyone near him. Spain celebrated its miracle child. Inside the palace, another ghost was being made. By the 1830s, the palace no longer felt like a home or even a court. It was a fortress of suspicion, a labyrinth of spies and shadows, all bent to the paranoia of Ferdinand VII. His obsession with betrayal, born from his grotesque body and magnified by decades of humiliation, now metastasized into a full system of surveillance that reached from his wife's bedchamber to the furthest provinces of Spain. The transformation began within the palace walls. Ferdinand, convinced that Maria Cristina conspired against him, had corridors rewired for listening, keyholes widened for peering, and servants recruited as informants. Ladies-in-waiting were interrogated daily. Priests heard confessions but were forced to report them to the king. Even Maria Cristina's sighs, her footsteps, her pauses in prayer were interpreted as signals of treachery. Courtiers learned to perform loyalty like actors in a never-ending play. Every gesture, every word, every glance had to be calculated. A smile too warm toward the Queen might be read as conspiracy. A word of sympathy for the Liberals as treason. Ministers entered the throne room trembling, knowing that a misplaced phrase could mean exile, imprisonment, or the gallows. But Ferdinand's paranoia did not stop at Madrid. It radiated outward, poisoning Spain itself. Across the country, he established a network of informants, priests, tavern keepers, soldiers, even children, paid to report whispers of dissent. Letters were opened, sermons monitored, plays censored, books banned, jails filled with writers, professors, and ordinary citizens accused of plotting revolution simply because they had spoken of liberty. He called it protection of the throne. His people called it the Policía de Sombras, the police of shadows. The irony was suffocating. While Ferdinand spied on his wife and crushed his own subjects, the Spanish Empire continued to disintegrate. The colonies in the Americas were gone: Mexico, Argentina, Colombia, Peru, lost to independence movements that Ferdinand barely acknowledged. He seemed more interested in intercepting Maria Christina's letters than in salvaging the empire. Ministers pleaded with him to act, but his mind was fixed on betrayal, not governance. The surveillance even followed him into his most private obsession, the bedchamber. When physicians attended him and Maria Christina, they were ordered to record every detail, every attempt, every failure. He demanded written reports not only of his wife's dutiful performance, but also of her facial expressions, her size, her tone of voice. It was not intimacy, it was interrogation disguised as marriage. For Maria Christina, life became a waking nightmare. She was never alone. Eyes watched her at prayer, ears strained to hear her whispers in sleep. Guards stood outside her doors as though she were both queen and prisoner. She wrote secretly to her family in Naples, "I live surrounded by mirrors, but none show my face, only his." And yet, while Ferdinand descended deeper into his paranoia, his body was collapsing. Years of indulgence, stress, and disease left him bloated, crippled, and often bedridden. His once brittle spine curved into near immobility. Gout swelled his legs until he could barely walk. He raged at his doctors, accusing them of poisoning him even as they tried to prolong his fading life. Still, he clung to his obsessions, spying, heirs, conspiracies, long after his body failed. The palace was transformed into a grotesque theatre of decline. A king who could barely stand still demanded that every whisper in Spain be reported to him. A monarch who had lost half his empire still obsessed over the movements of his young queen. The surveillance state Ferdinand built did not die with him. It lingered, festering, a legacy of fear that haunted Spain long after his bones turned to dust. But for those who lived inside his court, under his gaze, under his listening walls, it was more than politics. It was suffocation. The air itself seemed filled with spies, every shadow alive, every silence dangerous. Spain had become a prison, and its jailer was a king too broken to rule and too paranoid to trust, whose curse had expanded from his body into an entire nation. By the mid-1830s, Ferdinand VII was a man visibly rotting on his throne. The body that had cursed his queens now betrayed him entirely. Once grotesquely bloated, he became gaunt and skeletal. Gout left him unable to walk without assistance. Dropsy swelled his legs until his skin split and oozed. He could no longer ride, barely stand, often not even rise from bed. His once proud Bourbon face collapsed into sagging jowls and glassy eyes. The palace, always a place of whispers, became a chamber of death. Servants moved silently around their monarch, terrified of his rages, for though his body was broken, his paranoia remained sharp and cruel. Ministers brought him decrees to sign as he lay propped up on pillows. his trembling hands barely able to guide the quill. At times he flew into violent fits, screaming that his doctors had poisoned him, that his wife betrayed him, that his own children plotted his death. Maria Cristina, now Queen Regent in all but name, played the role of devoted wife in public. She stood by his bedside, dabbed his brow with cloth, whispered prayers over him. But in private, her calculation was relentless. She knew the dynasty's survival rested not on Ferdinand, but on the child she had borne, Isabella. She built alliances with the army, the clergy, and the liberal factions who would one day decide whether Isabella ruled or was cast aside. Ferdinand, meanwhile, clung to Isabella with a ferocity born of desperation. He proclaimed her the rightful heir, issuing the pragmatic sanction to secure her succession. But this decree tore Spain apart. The conservative Carlists who supported Ferdinand's brother Don Carlos rejected Isabella as illegitimate. Civil war loomed, and the king's death became the pivot on which the future of Spain would turn. In his final months, Ferdinand's chamber was a grotesque theatre of decay. Priests stood vigil, sprinkling holy water and pressing relics to his body. Physicians drained his swollen limbs, cut his flesh to release fluid, applied leeches by the dozen. None of it eased his suffering. His body was a battlefield, and every attempt to preserve it only added new torments. Witnesses described the smell of rot permeating the palace. The king, once draped in silks and jewels, now lay surrounded by soiled sheets, his skin ulcerated, his breath foul. Servants wept not out of sorrow, but from the stench that filled the halls. And yet, even in these final weeks, his paranoia burned. He demanded his wife's chambers be searched, her letters opened. He accused his doctors of conspiring to hasten his death. He even ordered guards to stand at his bedside at night, convinced assassins would creep in to smother him. On September 29, 1833, Ferdinand VII finally died. The felon king, as his people had come to call him, left behind not glory, but ruin, a country bankrupt, an empire shattered, a court haunted by ghosts of queens broken by his curse. He was buried with pomp he no longer deserved, priests chanting as cannons roared outside. But the mourning was hollow. Across Spain, peasants starved, liberals plotted revolt, and Carlists prepared for war. His daughter, Isabella, barely 3 years old, was proclaimed queen. Maria Cristina, the calculating survivor, became regent. But the kingdom Ferdinand left her was not whole. It was fractured, bleeding, and spiraling toward civil war. The dynasty had survived, but Spain itself teetered on the edge of collapse. Ferdinand's curse did not end with his death. It lived on in the wars and betrayals that followed, in the fractured legacy of a king whose body had poisoned not just his wives, but an entire nation. When Ferdinand VII was laid in his coffin in 1833, Spain did not bury merely a king. It buried a reign that had become synonymous with decay, humiliation, and cruelty. His body, twisted by disease and deformity, had dictated his destiny, and by extension, the destiny of an empire. What began as a personal curse became a national catastrophe. 3 queens had died within his grasp. Maria Antonia of Naples, the young bride whose laughter died under the weight of his demands. Maria Isabel of Portugal, who wasted away amid contraptions and paranoia, her spirit crushed before her body gave out. Maria Josepha of Saxony, who endured with the cold patience of a physician, only to perish in childbirth, her baby carried off in the same tide of blood and despair. The 4th, Maria Cristina of Naples, survived only by calculation. She endured his obsessions and his spies, bearing the child who would inherit his throne. She outlived him, but not the scars of a marriage that was more captivity than companionship. And what of Spain? Under Ferdinand, the empire that had once ruled the New World disintegrated. Mexico, Argentina, Chile, Colombia, Peru, all were lost while he obsessed over his bedchamber. The people, starving and censored, were smothered under his surveillance state, their hopes of reform crushed again and again. When he died, he left not stability but civil war, the Carlist Wars that would tear Spain apart for decades. The irony of his life was almost theatrical. Ferdinand, the man desperate to prove his masculinity, became Europe's symbol of impotence. Revolutionary pamphlets mocked him not just as a tyrant, but as a monster of the flesh, a grotesque cautionary tale of what happens when deformity, paranoia, and unchecked power entwine. Even his nickname, El Rey Felon, the Felon King, echoed across Europe like a curse. But perhaps the most haunting legacy was not political at all, but human. The ghosts of his queens lingered in Madrid, in the whispers of servants who swore they heard weeping in abandoned chambers, in the plaster death masks Ferdinand himself had kept as though to preserve his failures in stone. A palace that should have echoed with lullabies and laughter became instead a mausoleum of broken brides. And yet from this horror emerged a fragile thread of survival. Isabella II, the little girl declared queen at 3 years old, became the torchbearer of the Bourbon line. Her reign would be tumultuous, marked by scandal and revolt, but her very existence testified to the desperate gamble that had been Maria Christina's marriage. In the end, Ferdinand VII left behind no glory, no victories, no empire. What he left was a story, a grotesque parable of power and the body, of how a king's private deformity became a nation's public tragedy. His reign is remembered not for what he built, but for what he destroyed: wives, trust, an empire, and the very soul of Spain. The palace he haunted became a tomb of echoes, and his name, cursed and whispered, a warning to history, that sometimes the greatest tyrannies are not born from strength, but from weakness twisted into cruelty.